Before the oil, things were very different. The communities on Great Britain's North Sea coast made their living from fishing and farming. Then the oil business came to town. The effects are still being felt. The story of oil and gas in the UK reaches back to the 1960s. Exploration revealed significant reserves. The first commercial extraction of oil from the North Sea took place in 1975. Over the years that followed, production grew, and with it the industry, the communities, the supply chains and the partnerships, which would make the North Sea one of the most challenging and rewarding offshore oil provinces in the world. In the 1980s, gas reserves became increasingly important. New technology was developed to allow smaller reserves to be brought on stream more cost-effectively. As oil and gas production in the North Sea passed its peak, attention turned to the deeper waters west of the Shetland Islands, far to the north of the Scottish mainland. New technology was needed to cope with the fresh challenge. Now, with a wealth of experience in the most challenging conditions, the UK industry exports more than oil and gas. Its expertise, born of years of practical work and research, is now in demand worldwide. The North Sea is a harsh environment. It's pushed technology and human resourcefulness to the limits. To benefit from the oil and gas beneath its stormy surface, the people of Great Britain had to develop new skills, build new communities, new industries. They had to embrace a new way of life. They were able to do so side by side with the old ways. They were able to preserve their environment and their quality of life. In fact, the oil and gas industry has brought countless benefits, not just to the workers in that industry, but to the whole British community. Let's look at how that came about. Back in the 1960s, Britain faced many economic problems. The biggest obstacle to growth was a shortage of affordable power. There was a real political will to develop the resources of the North Sea.
30 years ago in Great Britain, particularly in Scotland, northeast of England, there was a major industrial transformation which posed many economic and social problems. Shipbuilding was in decline, iron and steel, and coal mining. I think therefore that the North Sea offered a major opportunity at exactly the right time historically for British industry to take advantage of North Sea oil exploitation, and also for us to use the real skills of our workforce in Scotland and the north of England.
The first impact was on communities like Aberdeen, the main city in the northeast of Scotland. Suddenly the city was full of incomers with money to spend. Hotels were full, bars and restaurants put up their prices. Local businesses started to do very well with this new injection of cash into the local economy. And that was just the start of Aberdeen's growth as an international oil capital.
And you've got to realise that we're coming out of the 60s, 1960s, when the biggest export from this area was people, young people, qualified people. So when the industry arrived, this was the turning point in terms of stemming that flow. And from 1969 onwards, when the first oil strike was made, but very early on, the local people, councils, etc., were able to see that this was going to be the start of a big area of change.
The companies that were here before oil and gas have had to modify themselves to cater for oil and gas, and have done that very successfully.
The service providers we worked with were local suppliers who, for example, provided the labour at the dockside, crews for standby boats, provided the staff at the airport.
When you have large companies coming into an area, in oil and gas or any other industry, they do need an infrastructure locally. They can't import everything. So there has to be a homegrown culture and homegrown industry in behind it.
Onshore, there was a little bit of resentment from some of the British people because they thought we were taking their jobs, but in actual fact we were getting them trained to take over those jobs.
Immediate challenges certainly we're trying to estimate very early on, which is quite hard, what the scale of this industry was going to be. Was it going to be around for 5 years and maybe not work out, or was it going to be around for 20 or 30 years as it actually has been? And based on that, therefore, how much land was going to be needed? Land for industry, land for housing, and more than just the area of land needed, how could you service that land for roads, for water and drainage? The County Council were quite optimistic and positive, and actually took quite a gamble at that time in terms of ensuring there was this area of land available. City Council also at that time were very futuristic in terms of dealing with Aberdeen Airport and dealing with Aberdeen Harbour.
The initial fears we had with the oil industry, I suppose, was loss of access to areas. We did worry about pipelines and the areas around oil rigs and wellheads, but that was just early worries, and it kind of progressed that even that really didn't cause us a problem.
Great care was taken to minimise the environmental impact. Today it's almost impossible to tell where pipelines come ashore. In fact, traditional industries continued side by side with the new. Oil and gas had a significant impact, but it didn't displace older traditional industries like farming, whisky distilling and fishing. Sustainable development was very important. The small provincial fishing town of Peterhead is a major energy hub for the UK. It hosts Europe's largest gas gathering plant and a large gas-fired power station, but still went on to become the largest whitefish port in Europe. The environment has been protected throughout, and this is down to three things: corporate responsibility on behalf of the oil industry, good planning decisions by government and the local authorities, and the engagement of the local community.
We've been farming here for nigh on 40 years. We're on quite a bit of livestock, as you can see in the background here. Oil and gas has certainly brought prosperity to our area. I doubt if it's brought much extra prosperity to farming, but there's been no downside, I don't think. The real fear in the area was it would get a huge influx of people. It would be everywhere, but luckily that didn't happen. Basically, the original oil men were all ranchers, and they were all farmers of one sort or another, and we're getting along quite nicely.
But although the impact was managed, there was a substantial influx of people into the northeast of Scotland. First, there were thousands of temporary workers involved in exploration, drilling, and the construction of platforms. Then there was a substantial growth in more permanent incomers.
There was major housing development in Aberdeen, and not only in Aberdeen itself, but within about 15 miles round Aberdeen there was a ring of towns, and they were able to become major settlement centres. And if you go to these towns now, up to maybe 30 or maybe even 50% of the folk who live in these towns travel to Aberdeen, and much of that travel is linked to working for the oil and gas industry. Really what you need to look at is what is the best way for the various partners or stakeholders to work together, whether it be in councils, airport, harbour, universities and colleges for training, and try and get that working as early as you can to see how do we react to this industry and how are we best placed to adapt, because being flexible is key.
We've had a long interest in international finance. That's been important in dealing with international companies who come to the North Sea, but in future is going to be especially important for some of the local companies who, as the North Sea may plateau, will be selling their products internationally. They need to have a good understanding of international contract law, international finance, and we provide the education for that, which helps to back up the way in which these companies are going to work in the future.
To develop a workforce with the relevant skills, Britain's universities had to create academic programmes. But there was also a need for practical training in skills needed in the oil and gas industry. Health and safety training was also vital. And with a large influx of new workers and their families, there was a need for schools to grow too.
In these early years, it is important to stress that one or two key decisions actually made a big difference in terms of what the future economic development would be.
In 1975, the first oil was brought ashore by tanker. Exploration gathered pace, but now there was a need for heavy engineering, port facilities for survey ships, standby vessels, pipe-laying barges and supply vessels. Communications were upgraded. New roads were built. Aberdeen Airport developed what was soon the busiest commercial heliport in the world. With major activity underway both offshore and in coastal towns and cities like Peterhead, Aberdeen, Lowestoft and Great Yarmouth, there was a pressing need for a local supply chain to be established. Local businesses sprang up to fill the gap.
The opportunities were very widespread, of course, because apart from the obvious industries and factories, you think about the catering needs, you think about the clothing needs, overalls, safety equipment, and British industry really responded to the new opportunities posed by the challenge of the North Sea.
Glenda Hogarth spotted an opportunity to supply offshore clothing.
P&O Energy had set up a supply house, Roop, Soup and Doop we called it, with wire rope and tools, etc. And they didn't have a clothing section. So the gentleman I went to see, I said, this is what we need. So whether he thought that was a bit of fun or not, he agreed, and that's how we started.
MCS is now about 20 years in business, and we grew out of a university. And we started by developing advanced analysis technology for analysing the dynamic responsive compliant riser systems. These are pipelines that connect between the seabed and the floating production system. And at that time, what we were doing in analysis terms was pretty advanced.
As events unfolded, however, it became clear that only a small proportion of the goods and services required on the United Kingdom's continental shelf were being sourced locally in the UK.
There were many opportunities for British companies, but of course oil and gas exploitation in the North Sea was a new business here in the United Kingdom. I think it's not so surprising that the oil and gas companies, international companies, were using suppliers and companies that they were already dealing with.
At first there were moves to protect British companies from overseas competition, but it was soon realised that this was a mistake.
In the early days in the North Sea, I chaired a group called BRIT, which was British Indigenous Technology. And our whole aim was to maximise the North Sea work that came to British-owned companies. I guess we quickly realised that actually the North Sea wouldn't develop efficiently without the major international expertise. And secondly, the big international companies were actually investing in the infrastructure. But more importantly, the kind of more we were feather-bedded in the early days in terms of getting preference, the less, when it came to it, we were going to be able to develop internationally. So I guess after 2 or 3 years, we adjusted our line, and BRIT became effectively the spokesman for all the significant service companies working in the North Sea and invested heavily in servicing in the North Sea. And frankly, that's been a big plus in the last, I guess, 10 to 15 years in companies like Wood Group being able to graduate and become genuine international players. So we weren't featherbed in the early days. We had to win our spurs, and that's helped us a lot internationally.
Supply chain management, a lot of people think, is just looking down the supply chain at the suppliers and the contractors, but it's actually looking up at your clients, it's looking internally at what you do. It's everything that you do in business, really. And it's cyclical as well. It doesn't end. There is nobody at the bottom of the supply chain. It cycles round that they'll be using fuel, which of course comes from the oil majors. So the whole supply chain is cyclical.
So what's the advice to anyone embarking on this process?
To develop an area is to start involving the local people immediately. Get them involved and get them to set up companies and be part of the infrastructure. It would grow a lot quicker and be a lot more efficient if that was the case.
Involve the whole supply chain, involve right down to the lowest denominator, the smallest company. They all have expertise and they're experts in their own field.
At first, local companies didn't always have the expertise to supply the needs of the oil operators. Results were needed immediately, and the UK government didn't want to slow things down. But in this case, the OSO encouraged foreign companies to set up subsidiaries or joint ventures with UK companies. Later, these subsidiaries became exporters themselves.
I guess we're doing about 60% of our business internationally now. So we have quite a lot of global reach. We have offices, as I mentioned, in Azerbaijan and Houston, but we've got partners throughout the world. And really, it's a global business, and if you're participating in that environment, you've got to be thinking globally too.
Of course, it wasn't all plain sailing. In 1988, the UK suffered the tragedy of Piper Alpha, where a production platform exploded with terrible loss of life. The UK industry learned from the experience. Controls and regulations were introduced, to help prevent anything like that happening again.
The government interacted with the industry mostly on a policing basis to make sure that the maintenance was kept up and that reserves were protected and people were protected. And that's about all the interference they had at that time. It's changed now a lot because since Piper Alpha, there's a strict legislative regime that makes sure things are done correctly.
The UK's North Sea oil and gas industry continues to make a massive contribution to British energy needs and the UK economy. Since production began from the North Sea, the industry has produced around 33 billion barrels of oil, and there's probably as much still left to produce. Work through Pilot, which is a cross-industry and government leadership group, continues to push these estimates up. Policies of full and fair opportunity. The search for new ways of working that reduce costs and benefit the whole industry. These have led to around 3,000 supplies and service companies of all sizes, supporting over 250,000 jobs throughout the UK. The UK oil and gas supply chain is strongest where Britain had traditional manufacturing skills. But the UK has also established many new companies in the downhole, exploration and oilfield support areas that produce niche products and services for the offshore industry.
Following the 86 oil price crash, the area had to really re-examine itself and say, what are our strengths? And they realised that the strengths were twofold. They weren't in buildings. The strengths were in skills of the people who worked here, and the strength was in the technology that had been gained. And that can be used not only here, but overseas. So from the base developed here, the technology in subsea or underwater work is now being marketed and used elsewhere.
UK Subsea Technology is the premier group in the world. We are in that position because we've really been developing subsea technology over a period of 25 years. Starting in the late 70s and then in the early 80s, when we in fact trialled and tested a lot of what is now today's technology. So it's from that basis, in fact, that we've now built up a huge industry. We have something of the order of 700 companies undertaking subsea technology activity, employing somewhere around about 30,000 people in this country, and generating goods to the value of about $4.5 billion per annum. Of that number, 50% is exported overseas.
So what are the results of all of this? Well, by the 1980s, the late 80s, about 70% of supplies were coming from British sources. But perhaps even more important, Britain and its workforce is now recognised internationally as a centre of excellence when it comes to oil and gas.
We always had the aspiration that eventually we will be more and more concerned with export matters. We expected that if we were successful, then the industry will be able to address overseas international opportunities. And if it's been nurtured successfully in the domestic market, so that it was competitive, it would be able to compete internationally.
So what are the particular strengths of the UK oil and gas industry? Britain has experience across the board, from exploration to delivery of affordable power to the consumer, all the way along the value chain. The UK is a world leader in downstream technology. It has developed the use of gas reserves to provide a local benefit to its own people. Oil from the North Sea was always seen as a commodity item which could be sold anywhere in the world. But gas had to have a local market to become worth developing. So in 1966, clean natural gas started to be brought ashore for British use. Now gas is the first choice for industrial, commercial and residential consumers. Supported by a national transmission system of over 6,400 kilometres and supplying about 20 million homes through a network distribution system, gas is now used extensively for cooking, heating, power generation, water heating and transport. This significant development has led a revolution in design and manufacturing technology, and the UK is now the envy of the world for its high-value, quality systems, backed up by significant standards of safety. Products are tested to destruction and monitored on a lifetime basis. The UK gas industry has developed and prospered to become a world leader.